Hey guys, what is up? SuperKmanrocks here, and we're here for my LPL Week 10 overview, analysis, and no power rankings at the end because this is the final week of LPL action here in the regular season in spring of 2023. Incredibly excited to go over this. By the end of this episode, we will know every team in the playoffs. We will know where they are standing in terms of, who's number 1, who's number 2, who's number 3, etc., etc. We will know who is officially eliminated. Of course, a lot of these teams either locked or eliminated going into the week with how the LPL has worked out so far, but we'll have a much better idea of where everybody is standing going into the most important part of spring, what we've all been building towards. So, if you were excited for the video, let me know down in the comments section below. Who did you think was going to make it in some of the final playoff spots? Obviously, not everything is locked. I believe there are still 4 or 5 spots in the playoffs up for grabs going into the week. And so there's more than enough chances for a couple of these teams to be able to make it in. But it's just going to be interesting to see who that ends up being. But with all that being said, it's time to jump into the review, of course, with the LPL. It's quite a lot of series to go over, quite a lot of games, so I want to try and jump into it as quickly as possible. Starting off with day number 1. Of course, we're going to be going through all 7 days of action, going through every single series, all 15 of them. Talking about my player of the game, 10 of the game, all that fun stuff. So let's kick it off with day number 1 in our first series of the week, which did actually have some playoff implications. We had Ninjas in Pyjamas taking on Royal Never Give Up. And NIP is able to take the 2-0 series. This is a really big loss for RNG, a team that, yes, should be able to make playoffs, but remember, this is not a lock by any means. Losing this actually drops them below 500 in terms of both series score and game score, and that's not particularly good. There are a lot of teams around them in the standings that are going to be really excited about this WE, Invictus Gaming. Those kinds of teams are really looking at RNG dropping this and feeling pretty excited, but good for NIP to be able to pick up this win. This team has just looked so much better and so much more efficient ever since Shadow came in and got kind of adjusted to the team. Obviously, he had a series earlier on, I think it was his first series in here for NIP that wasn't particularly good, but outside of that, ever since it really felt like he started to mesh a lot better with the rest of the team, he's looked really good for this team, an absolute upgrade to Xiaolan Bao in that jungle position, in my opinion. And he had another really good series here, especially that Vi game in game number 1. Incredibly controlling in the early game, was able to generate a nice strong lead for the team, and then being able to dive into the backline. Vi and Tazeri is a good matchup. I know I kind of shit on Vi on this channel a bit in terms of what she offers, because I do think that she is more feast or famine than people give her credit for. She's not just this direct counter to Zeri 100% of the time. If she's ahead, she absolutely, though, counters Zeri, and that's what happened here in game number 1. And then game 2 was run by the bot lane. Really, really good series coming out from them. That's going to be my player of the series. It's going to go to Zhuo in the support position. I've actually been a little bit higher on Zhuo than maybe some other analysts, which is crazy considering I've been much lower on him as a player throughout, his history, on Top Esports. It's just really good to see him actively play well. I think Fodak and Zhuo have been relatively fine as a bot lane this split, even when the rest of the team is kind of a disaster. Dream in particular has had a really bad split. I know some people are going to talk about him being a lot better towards the second half, and I do completely agree. We'll talk about him in a second, but Fodak and Zhuo have really been pretty solid for this team. I know a lot of people really like Fodak as a player. A lot of people consider him one of the better ADs in the league. I'm not sure I'm on that train, but I do certainly think he is a solid ADC, someone that you can win games with, as we've seen in the past couple of years. But to have Zhuo be able to step up, to have this bot lane be solid, that Soraka game was really fun. Soraka's just one of those champions that it feels like every time she's picked in pro play, she absolutely does work. There are very few situations where I've seen a Soraka actually get punished at a high level, and that just makes me wonder why she's not getting picked more. But overall, just a really good series and a really good game from the bot lane and then the jungle as well. Dream has stepped up. He's played a lot better. They're allowing him to play some of these more aggressive picks that I think he was playing a lot more last year at the beginning of the year for Victory 5. It's good to see him maybe get his confidence back. I mean, he was abysmal. You could have really made the case that he was the worst mid laner in the entire league through the first 4 or 5 weeks of the season. He deserved to get benched when he got benched. I know a lot of people are saying that he's elo trapped on this team, but I think that's just reputation kind of coming through. It certainly is not the performance that he was putting out on the Rift this split, but he has stepped it up, I think, a lot in the past couple of weeks. And I think Shadow coming in has been a big reason for that. I think him and Shadow work so much better as a duo than him and Xiaolan Bao do, and that definitely showed itself off in this series. But overall, NIP was just solid. There really isn't a lot of negatives to say about their performance. It's a lot easier to talk about RNG in this one, losing, because that is unacceptable. This is a team that throughout the year, every single time it feels like they're finally starting to build momentum, it just disintegrates so quickly into thin air. It feels like this team can never actually sustain any relative amount of success, no matter what they do. At the beginning of the year, they had no idea who they wanted to play in the mid lane. It was Tong Yuan, it was Angel. They were going back and forth. They finally settled on Angel, and he came in, and the team started to finally gain some ground. Like, they were pretty far below 500, but they started to fight back. It felt like topside was playing a lot better. Gala has been good all split long, and then Ming coming back obviously helped that, but things have just not been consistent. This is another series where it's just like, this is not the RNG that needs to exist, and it raises a lot of question marks for what they're going to be able to do, even if they do make playoffs. My dud of the series is going to go to Wei. I know a lot of blame is going to get thrown on Breathe and on Angel as two players that I think aren't necessarily performing up to expectations for the team, but man, it's Wei. Like, for me, like, Wei has probably been this team's most inconsistent player over the course of the year. I know it gets a little bit more difficult to jungle when your laners aren't winning, but he loses pressure so early on in games, and I know Wukong into Vi or Wukong into Elise isn't exactly supposed to, like, dominate that matchup, but just, it feels like a lot of the aggressive plays that he was making in previous years are just gone. He is a carry-oriented jungler that seems to have forgotten how to carry, and that's incredibly concerning in my opinion. There are a lot of things about RNG that are concerning, but Wei, to me, is at the top of that list. I still think Gala is good. I thought Breathe had a really good series. He was doing a ridiculous amount of damage in both of these games, on the Gwen and on the Jace, but unfortunately just not much coming out of this mid-jungle duo, and that's just kind of a trend for RNG. It has not been a strength for them over the course of the year when they win games. It is often through Gala and Ming or Breathe just having a really good game, and that's just not super predictable going into playoffs. There's a chance that they're going to be able to do it, but they're going to be playing teams that have other good jungle mid duos, and they're going to need to be able to keep up. So Wei, Angel need to get on the same page, and Wei in particular really needs to get back to the form that he has been on over the first couple of, years on RNG here, because what he has shown so far in 2023, in my opinion, is not it. As for NIP, really good win. I mean, this is solid. You're out of the playoffs, and obviously you're not going to be able to make it, but Shadow coming in, I think, has really created a new narrative around what they're going to be doing going into summer. Obviously, Spring Split's going to be over relatively soon for them, but this is an interesting roster with some interesting pieces, and I definitely understand the ideology of bringing him in and hopefully getting enough cohesion so that when you do end up going into summer, you might have this, little bit of an extra step ahead that can get you into the top 10. And then moving on to our second series of day number 1. And it's kind of a blowout, but an expected blowout, if we're being honest. We had JD Gaming taking on LGD Gaming, with JDG picking up the 2-0 series win, and if they did anything else, I mean, it still would have been JDG. It's the team they've kind of been all split long, but this is anticipated, right? This is the best team in the LPL going up against LGD, who, for their credit, have overperformed a lot of expectations. Players like Xiaoshu and Haichao, I think, have been playing a lot better as of late, but they're not ready to go up against JDG. It's just not in the cards for them, but I do want to give a shout out to JDG. I actually thought I would get more pushback over the course of the year for having them at number 1 every single week. Like, they've lost games to teams that they shouldn't lose to. They've been relatively inconsistent, especially in best of threes, dropping a game to, some random team in the standings, right? They've lost just a bit more than people would have expected them to, but obviously, to me, they're still the team with the highest upside in the league, and I don't think it's particularly close. I'm still just waiting for JDG to kind of put it together. We've seen flashes of it, and that's what gives me the confidence to keep them at number 1. I thought I would get more pushback because, when you hear the conversation surrounding the best teams in the LPL, really a lot of people have just been talking about EDG and LNG as the top 2 teams in the last couple of weeks. Maybe not so much after last week, but, towards the back half of the year, you go watch a lot of streams of, prominent analysts in the scene, and they're kind of saying that. I haven't heard JDG thrown in that conversation all too much, and so I thought I would get pushback for keeping JDG at 1 the whole season, but I really haven't. I guess people just know the talent level, and they agree with me that if this team is right, they're still the best team in the league. And luckily for them, they were the best team in this series. I mean, they were dominant. Ruler is going to get my player of the series in the bot lane. His positioning is just perfect. He's honestly gone under the radar, which is kind of crazy to say in terms of what JDG has been able to do over the course of the year. You can talk about how maybe, dropping games here or there, but Ruler's positioning and his flash plays are right up there with anybody. Like, he's in the MVP conversation. He's right up there, in my opinion, with Scout or with Elk or whoever you want to throw, JJ, whoever you want to throw into that, MVP conversation. I think Ruler is right there with almost any of them. He was my favorite for the first, half of the split. Now, obviously, things haven't gone exactly like they did during the first half of the split, but he's had a phenomenal series. He's been the most, I would say, resource-heavy player here on JDG, which is a positive. It gives them a direction to go for. And I do think he's just made the team better. I think him playing late-game carries is positive because he is incredibly aggressive in the mid-game. And so if he does generate that lead that we know he can just by outplaying a lot of his opponents, there's not really a lot of places for them to look back. I will say Missing has been a little bit over-aggressive a couple of times this split. It's something to keep in mind. It's weird because I always felt like I was right on the mark with Missing in terms of my analysis of him over the course of 2022, but people were really mad about the way I analyzed him. I said, he was a borderline top 20 player in the world, and, he was a really good support, one of the top 5 supports in the world, but I didn't necessarily see him on the same level as, like, Keria, right? He was just a really good support, kind of the same way that I see a player like, I don't know, Gala, for RNG. Maybe not in that same tier as, like, the best, but, like, right below it, absolutely, right? But people didn't like that. People were saying Missing was the best support in the entire world. I don't think he's necessarily played like the best support in the entire world over the course of this split. He's been fine, but I definitely think some of those engages have been way too aggro. He hasn't really connected with Ruler, I would say, in terms of a duo. There are times where it really works, but there are also times where it doesn't, and I think it does raise some question marks. Shout out to Knight. No one plays Syndra like him. Like, he's just the best Syndra in the world, and it's not particularly close. What a fun game 2. And then Kanavi was also great in that game 2 on the Vi. LPL Vi players are just built different. That champion looks so much different in this region than it does in any of the other regions, and it's not particularly close. So basically everybody on JDG stepping up and just having a pretty solid series. Then for LGD on the other side, I'm not particularly shocked to see them lose to JD Gaming. I mean, they've kind of gotten hot as of late, I would say. Their record doesn't necessarily show that, but they've been playing much, much better. I think Xiaoshu's emergence in the top lane has definitely kind of facilitated that, but going into 369, he's going to have his hands tied in this series, and it's going to be up to a lot of the rest of the players. Unfortunately, they couldn't really make it happen. LPC was able to generate some gold, but a lot of it was cleanup kills. Like, that scoreline looks pretty good, but there really wasn't a lot that he was actually doing in a lot of these games. Haichao was fine. Meteor was pretty bad. He lost jungle pressure, especially in game 2, very, very early on. And I'm going to give dud of the series to Jinzhao in the support position. 2 games of Nautilus. When you're playing Nautilus from behind, you're probably going to look pretty bad because the only thing that champion can do is go in. I mean, you could sit back and peel, but then you're just kind of being useless. You're not actively doing anything in a lot of fights, and so for LGD, just not a lot of positives. Again, this is a series that we kind of expected to go the way that it did. We're not particularly surprised to see them get stomped. Talent-wise, there's a massive gap between these two, and it definitely showed on the Rift. I still think that there are positives to take away from this team going into summer, but this is kind of a throwaway series, I would say, overall for them. But for JDG, it kind of cements them at the top of the standings right now. There's a lot of inconsistency coming out with the other teams that are kind of contending with them, and all they really have to do is win to lock themselves into the #1 seed. If they win out, they've got it. And so, a pretty good situation for JDG. Game difference is definitely on their side. They haven't really dropped a ton of series to, like, the bad teams, and so they've ended up with a pretty good game score, and that's going to help them out when they race for that #1 seed. But overall, this team is ridiculously talented. If their head's on straight, if they're playing together, they're unbeatable, in my opinion, in the LPL, but that hasn't always been the case. It's just nice to see them also get the job done here against an LGD team that can be a little bit tricky. Moving on now to day number 2 in week number 10, and we kick day 2 off with a matchup between 2 teams that have the same record, but they really shouldn't. They should not be in the same position. One drastically underperforming in recent weeks, and you could say the other is overperforming. We had OMG taking on Top Esports, and OMG continues to win here. They pick up another big win, this time over a Top Esports team whose just death spiral has been completely confounded over the course of the last couple of weeks. They are in the most tragic of states that they could possibly have been in, considering how this split started, but we're going to talk about them in a bit. We always talk about the winning team first here, so let's talk about OMG. They were solid here, and that's kind of what they've been over the course of the season. Solid. Some games are just not going to be nearly as consistent. I think Game 2 is a good example of that, but they have the talent to be able to go up against a lot of other really good players. They have a lot of players that other teams really wanted, Shanji being chief among them. He's going to get my player of the series. Spoiler alert. You can see it up on the screen. It's not a spoiler. Shanji's going to get my player of the series, and obviously a lot of discussion here surrounding, Shanji, because Top Esports was very publicly targeting Shanji in the offseason. He stays on OMG. They end up going with Qingtian instead in the top lane, and, that ends up not working out for them in this particular series. Now, it is worth noting that Shanji is not exactly had the best of 2023s, in my opinion. He's probably been the most inconsistent player on OMG over the course of the year. He's had some good games, but he's also been completely run over on some picks as well. It's good to see him get back to some of his roots. I really like him on some of these AP carries on the top side. Obviously, Rumble comes to mind, but Kennan's kind of in a similar vein in terms of crazy teamfight ultimate. a good amount of pressure in the early lane phase. Like, you do play them relatively similarly. Obviously, they're not exact, but, you know, there are a lot of similarities between the two. And I think Shanji kind of getting back to that, getting more comfortable, you know, playing back with this team, I think is obviously just going to be a positive overall. And I thought he was good. The Kennen ultimates in particular were absolutely devastating in this series. Game 3 was disgusting, and it could have been a lot worse for OMG if Shanji had not been able to, you know, be able to get some of those Kennen ultimates off, especially towards the Baron pit. Obviously, a couple of other players playing really well. I want to give a ton of credit to Aki. Really good with some objectives fighting in this game. Stealing Baron was absolutely massive for the team, but Aki in general has been a hugely underrated piece for OMG. In my opinion, he's been the best player on this team in 2023, and I think it really hasn't been all that close, and that's coming from someone who really does like Shanji and Cream and Abel and PP God a lot. Aki was the player that I thought was going to be the weak link for OMG going into the year. That has absolutely not been the case. He's been really solid for this team. Cream is still good. He gets to play his champions, a couple Ahri games, a Kassadin game. He loves his assassins. As long as he gets them, he's probably going to look fine. Abel gets 3 games of Aphelios. Again, more comfort, and that's really the overarching theme for OMG. I think if they get comfort against a team that they can go head-to-head with, macro and mechanic-wise, they're going to be able to come out on top because it really does separate them in a way that a lot of other teams just don't have. They are so good at their specific style of the game that if other teams let them play it, they're probably just going to win. So big credit to OMG. I thought they were solid in this one. On the other side, you have Top Esports. Not exactly solid in the same way. Obviously, they're in complete freefall mode right now. There's nothing I can tell you that is going to, you know, change that opinion, but really, it has been quite easy to identify the issues that are going on with this team. I know a lot of people on Reddit, on the internet, are pointing to individual player performances as being the issue. And while I agree, like, certain performers are not, you know, living up to expectations, Ching Tian's been a lot worse over the course of this run. Rookie's been a lot worse. Tian has just not been good this split. I don't think Jackie Love and Mark are being as aggressive and therefore as game, you know, saving as I think they may have been able to have been in the past for this team. But I think when you're looking at the grand issue for Top Esports, to me, it is so clearly macro. Like, this team doesn't actually struggle all that much to generate leads in the early game, or at least be relatively competent in the early game. You know, go into the mid game in a position where you're still very much in a position to win with maybe a late game scaling comp like you were in a lot of these games. The unfortunate part is they have no freaking clue what to do from that point in the game, and that's something that I think is, luckily, more fixable. Again, I talk about this on the channel all the time. You can't really fix just being worse than the people that you're playing against. I mean, you can get better, but that's kind of hard to do, especially when you've already reached this level, and to do it so quickly, it's just not expected. What is fixable is good players not knowing what to do with their resources. You can coach a team to know what to do in the mid game, and Top Esports is full of players that are very coachable in that respect. I mean, a lot of these players have been able to do this at a very high level for many years. You just have to get their confidence back on track, and you have to get their ability to play in the mid game back on track. I think the best example of that to me is Ching Tian in the top lane, who is going to get my dud of the series here, but again, I see so much hate on him just weeks after people are saying, how stupid was it that Wayward was playing over him last year? Again, the back and forth and the flip-flopping that this fandom goes through is absolutely insane, but you know, Ching Tian, again, I understand, has not had the best run of things. He's still an incredibly talented top laner. If you can get him in a right situation where he feels a lot more comfortable in specific matchups that he's going to see, that's going to help so much. People are going to really criticize his Malphite this series. I thought it was fine in Game 2, but it wasn't particularly good in Game 3. He was down a ton of CS to the Kennen and just gave up a ton of pressure. The ultimates really weren't all that useful, even if he wasn't actively inting the game away, but you're just looking for more, right? And I think that's it. It's not that Ching Tian has been the worst top laner in the league or anything. It's that Top Esports doesn't need a mid-tier top laner. They need a good top laner, especially when Tian and Rookie aren't going to ball out. Now, Rookie had a great game in Game 2 on the LeBlanc, but outside of that, he was put on the Galio, you know, another game of LeBlanc where you're going into an Ahri who's just probably going to have more prio than you in a lot of those matchups. Tian's not having a particularly good season. In fact, I would argue he's been probably the more obviously bad player for Top Esports over the course of the year. There's just a lot to fix here, but to me, it boils down to macro. If you can get macro on track, if you can get these guys making good decisions, if you can get Top Esports feeling comfortable again about the game that they're playing with confidence and, you know, going into the mid game and making these aggressive plays and not being afraid to try to take leads, if that's the team that comes back out, this team can still be a threat in the playoffs. Like, their players haven't changed. We were calling them one of the best teams in the world just a couple of weeks ago, about a month ago. If they can get back to just playing with that confidence and playing with that passion, they're going to be a dangerous team, especially at the point that they're going to be at in the bracket. Now, obviously, nothing's solidified yet, but they're down to 8-7, and there's a very real chance that they end the regular season at 500. It would be a disaster, but Top Esports controls that with their own play. As for OMG on the other side, they're looking real good. Again, this is a team that has only been high up in the standings, basically all split long. I was high on OMG going into the year. I had them ranked, I believe, 6th in my preseason power rankings. That's looking pretty good. They might finish almost exactly there. Now, I don't think that they're going to be a team that is like the 6th best team, especially with how, maybe the bracket might end up breaking out, but OMG is certainly not a team you can take lightly, and again, like I said, if you give them everything that they want, they're probably going to punish you for it, and so big ups to OMG. I think, generally speaking, they're kind of underrated right now in terms of the grand scheme, and they're definitely a team to be watched out for. And then moving on to our second series of day number 2 now. And again, this is another one with pretty major playoff implications because it's one of the teams that is desperately fighting for a spot at the bottom of the playoffs, playing against a team that has locked themselves in. We had Team WE taking on Weibo Gaming, and Weibo is able to pick up the win in a 2-1 series that they had no business winning. I mean, there is no reason that Weibo should be able to walk out of this one feeling good at all about themselves, but I mean, other than the fact that they were able to take the game, I guess that's a pretty important way to feel good about it, but Weibo didn't exactly earn that Game 3 win. I would more so say that WE kind of threw away a really nice situation that they set up for themselves. But let's talk about the series as a whole. Both Game 1 and Game 2, I would say, were relatively favored in terms of the teams that ended up winning them. Game number 1, I thought was a really good early game coming out from Weibo that they just transitioned really nicely into a strong late game win. The Shy was awesome in that game. He was really good on the Gnar into Bubu's Cassante. Not that that's particularly surprising. The Shy is probably the most mechanically talented top laner outside of Zeus in the world, and Bubu might be the worst laner in the LPL, and so to see the Shy be able to generate such a large lead in a matchup that I do think is relatively Gnar favored, I don't think is particularly surprising at all. He did a good job translating that. And then in Game 2, it was a little bit different. I would say that, Weibo had moments where they looked okay, but Xiaohu played the mid game really, really poorly. And honestly, I gotta give a big shout out to Bubu in the top lane on that Cassante. He may have really struggled in lane against the Kennen, but those teamfight flanks were great, and that's what Bubu does. He's going to be someone who gets absolutely blasted for the first 15 minutes of the game, but if he can survive, he's going to be fine in teamfights. He's going to be a positive for your team, or at least that's what he's been in 2023 so far, and I think that's what he was in that game number 2. Hang had a good early game, both in that game and in game number 3, where WE actually did a good job being able to generate a lead with Ornn, Ryze, and Aphelios against a Lucian, a Taliyah, a Renekton, a Vi. You're feeling golden. You're feeling like this game is over if you've got a lead in the mid game at that point, but some really poor team fighting coming out from WE, and Weibo is able to snatch the series from there. My player of the series is going to go to Xiaohu in the mid lane. Pretty good series, I would say, overall from him. He was not so good in game number 2, especially in the team fights. I just thought the Ahri charms just weren't coming out. He was a little bit too aggro, getting caught out, but some really important damage coming out from the Taliyah. I mean, it is very rare to see a Taliyah just dominate team fights as much as this one was. Obviously, wasn't the only one doing so, but he was doing by far the most damage on the side of Weibo Gaming, and it's just very impressive to see that. This is what we were talking about with Xiaohu in 2022. This is actually a point I brought up very consistently over my weekly reviews last year, but Xiaohu plays Taliyah a little bit different than everybody else because he's not this shove and roam, help out your jungler, try to establish a macro lead kind of player. He's someone who is actively going to try and make Taliyah a burst mage and try to carry on her in the same way that you would almost any other mid lane hyper carry. And that makes it very intriguing to play around him because it gives him the versatility of taking fights on his own or grouping up with the rest of his team. He can show up to almost anything. And if he's been funneled with gold like he likes to be, especially on this pick, he can do a lot of damage. So big credit to Xiaohu. Love to see him on this champion. He always plays it at a super high level. And then, of course, like I said, credit to the Shy. I thought he was really good in lane in this series. Wasn't the best in teamfights in Game 2. If those Kennen ults were a tad bit better, maybe this game actually is a lot more difficult for WE to win. But Renekton in Game 3 kind of made up for that. He was really solid in that one, too. It's just kind of hard. Xiaohu's had a really good year, and I think he's, taken a lot of the positive attention from me in particular. I know a lot of the community pretty much only talks about the Shy and Karsa, and I understand why. When you have those two players on the team, most of the discussion is going to be centered around them, both for positive and for negative, but Xiaohu, I think, has definitely been the one that has taken a lot of my attention, and so the Shy's kind of gone, quote-unquote, under the radar, but he's been fine this split. He's had some really bad games, but he's had some fine ones, too. I think this is very similar to his 2022, in my opinion. Light and crisp. Not so good in lane. Honestly, I was really disappointed with how they were able to play out some of their winning matchups in the bot lane. The Draven game was not good coming out from them. They take away the Nami and they're just not able to do anything with it. And then they also lost on Lucian Nami in game number 3. Maybe it's Crisp who just doesn't want to play the fish, but either way, I was hoping for a little bit more, and honestly, this bot lane has taken a little bit of a step back in recent weeks. Hopefully that's not a trend that continues into playoffs, because they'll need them when they start getting into some important playoff series. But overall, Weibo looked good in this series. I'm kind of nitpicking. I know I've said that, oh, they shouldn't be exactly happy with how this turned out, but a win is a win at the end of the day. I just think that there are a lot of areas that they still can clean up. As for WE on the other side, you really should have won this series, and clearly for a team that is pushing for playoffs, this is not the time of the year to be losing a series like this. Dud of the series was a no-brainer. It's going to go to Hope in the bot lane. He just was kind of bad this series. There's really no other way to put it. I know his stat line doesn't exactly show that off. Leading the team in kills looks pretty good, but positioning-wise, he was miserable, especially in Game 3 on that Aphelios. He pretty much single-handedly lost them that Game 3. If he was a little bit safer, was, a little bit more consistent in the way that he was dealing damage in a lot of these team fights, I honestly think they just win the game, straight up there and then. But even in the leads that he was able to get in lane, he just wasn't able to do a lot with them in the mid game, even on the Lucian in the game that they won in Game 2. So disappointing there. It's kind of the opposite of what Hope's, issue, quote-unquote, has been over the course of the year. I've said that his laning is pretty bad, but he's pretty consistent in late game team fights. That was the opposite here. His laning was solid, and his team fighting was abysmal, and so I don't really know what to tell you. Hang had some good early games, but again, the guy just has no idea what to do in the mid game. Some of those engages in Game 3 on the Lee Sin were just a little bit over-ambitious. Shanks does not like to play with the rest of his team. It looks like he doesn't trust them. And I've already talked a bit about BOB. Some awful laning phases, but some good team fighting in Game 2. Overall, WE's not out by any means. It's not like they've been eliminated from the playoffs from this, but it certainly doesn't solidify them quite like a win would have that they were so close to getting. You really wanted this, but it makes their series later on in the week even more important. If they're able to pick up that win, they are in a good position to make the playoffs, but now you have basically given yourself a win or go home situation. As for Weibo on the other side, they've obviously already locked a playoff spot, but they're looking for top 4. That's going to be the dream for them. Obviously, LPL kind of splits into quadrants, and 3 and 4 are in their own, so they definitely would rather be the 4th seed than the 5th seed. This win goes a long way towards getting you there. 10 wins is a very big accomplishment here in the LPL, and if they can close out their year in the same way that they were in this series, that's going to be huge towards ending up in the playoffs in a much better spot, I should say. Moving on now to day number 3 in this final LPL week. And we get an interesting matchup, top team versus bottom team. This game definitely still has some playoff implications, but not nearly as much as some of the ones we've listed before. We had LNG Esports taking on Ultra Prime. And LNG is able to get the job done, but crucially for them, they are not able to do it in a 2-0 sweep. They actually drop game number 2 in this series, which is honestly pretty bad for them because it means that a lot would have to go right for them to now get into the top 2. They were in a decent spot. They're guaranteed top, I believe, 3 at this point, but you would have been able to be in the conversation for top 2 had some things gone right if you would have gone perfect in this game. Unfortunately, couldn't quite get the perfect game, but it still is a pretty good series for them nonetheless. Being able to pick up the win is incredibly important. Ultra Prime, on the other hand, honestly, you'll kind of take this. This is their first game win in a month. It's been quite a long time since this team has even won a game, let alone against LNG, and so I think both teams are going to be walking out of this feeling at least okay. For LNG, it just continues to be a similar story to what we've talked about, basically the entire split for them up until this point. It's Scout, it's Tarzan looking fantastic. Those two are the best jungle mid duo in the LPL right now, and I don't think it is particularly close. I think they just play at a level that other teams just aren't really able to match. When they're having good games, they just win, especially against lower tier teams like Ultra Prime, because the talent level is just too high. When Scout gets the ball rolling, he is unstoppable. Had a great game in game number 1 on the LeBlanc. Honestly, kind of an underratedly great game in game 1 on the LeBlanc. And then another fantastic game in game number 3 on the Ari. Just really, really good stuff. He's going to get player of the series again here. I know that there's a lot of discussion right now over who the MVP should be, who it's going to be. I think Scout's got to be near the top or at the top of basically everyone's list at this point. LNG as a team is good, but if they didn't have a player like Scout who is performing at the level that he has been at over the course of this year so far, this would not be a top 3 seed in the LPL, I'm telling you that. This team would be a little bit worse. That's not to say the rest of the team sucks or anything. Like I said, I think Tarzan's been awesome over the course of the year. I think Zika looked good in this series. He actually played a tank 2 games in a row. That's a big dub for the team. I think LP and Hang have gotten better. I think there's not really a lot of responsibility on LP's shoulders, and I think that's helped him get a lot more used to playing at the LPL level, and Hang is obviously just a good support. Maybe a little bit underwhelming this year, but still an incredibly solid support. But if you don't have Scout, like, none of this works in the same way, and so big credit to Scout, big credit to LNG. He's going to be one of the front runners for MVP for a lot of people, and it's for good reason. But Tarzan definitely deserves to be in that conversation as well. You can make a really strong case that Tarzan has been a top 2, top 3 jungler in the LPL this split, and I don't think a lot of people are going to be arguing with you on that. He has been incredibly consistent, and I think that's really the big positive. That's kind of the big selling point for Tarzan this split if you're going to want to vote for him for All-Pro, is just the consistency. He hasn't really had a single bad game all split. He's just generally been solid all split long. In the early game, in the late game, it doesn't really matter. He plays his role to basically perfection. And especially in the LPL, there just aren't a lot of other junglers who can say anything remotely close to that. So those two players make LNG incredibly dangerous, but they have been making LNG incredibly dangerous all year long. It's good to see Zika step up and have a solid series in the top lane. Like I said, LP and Hang are a little bit low resource on the bot side, but that's a positive, I would say, overall for LNG, because it doesn't put too much responsibility on their shoulders to be able to carry the weight of what LNG likes to do. I like how this team is constructed. Do I think that they are a championship contender? Maybe. Like, there's definitely a world in which Tarzan and Scout continue to completely ball out, but, it'll be interesting to see if teams adapt a little bit to them as we get into the playoffs, what with, kind of their main carries coming from basically 1 or 2 roles every single game. It's going to be interesting, but LNG, when they are, getting to play their style, they're awesome at it. As for Ultra Prime on the other side, they're just not very good. Again, winning a game here is incredibly positive for a team that just has not been able to win games over the course of the last few weeks. Forge has come in full-time now to play mid lane. I assume he's going to be playing into summer as well, but he is not going to be the problem on this team, and the problems are definitely standing out. Early in the split, I was saying it was Ching, but especially in the last couple of weeks, ever since he's been replaced, it's been Ning in the jungle. He's going to get another dud of the series for me. He's gotten a lot of these this year for Ultra Prime. I feel kind of bad giving it to him in this particular series because I actually do think that he played Game 2 really well on the Xin Zhao. Unfortunately, he was so abysmal in Games 1 and 3 that even if I think he was probably the player of the game in Game number 2, he deserves dud of the series for how bad he played in their losses. He just got run over by Tarzan in the jungle, some initiations that were just way too overeager on a champion that isn't particularly strong right now, and so not really a huge fan of what Ning is doing either in this series or in the LPL right now. Him and Baolan have, neither have really come back into the LPL and been the IG players that we knew and loved when they won a world title in 2018. They both looked like bottom tier players at their positions, and I honestly don't expect a lot of that to change. Doggo was particularly bad in game number 3, but he's still kind of been this team's shining light over the course of the year, and Harry in the top lane. He's talented. You can see it. He has some good mechanics, and he's able to keep up with some players, but for the most part, he's made almost zero impact on any game over the course of this split. I really have not been, ridiculously impressed with what he's offered. I put Ultra Prime down to my bottom spot in my power rankings at the end of last week, or I think 2 weeks ago now, and that has absolutely been the correct placement. This team has just not been competitive, so even seeing them be able to take a game off of LNG is positive. And then for LNG, obviously you would have liked to 2-0 the series, given yourself an opportunity to get into that top 2 should one of those teams kind of disappoint, but at the very least, you've now put yourself in a position to guarantee yourself top 3, which is really, really good. I think going into the year, if you would have told this org and this team that they would be guaranteed top 3, they would be pretty excited about that. And then moving on to our second series of day number 3, this one definitely having immediate playoff implications for one of the teams. We had Invictus Gaming taking on Bilibili Gaming, and BLG picks up the 2-0 series win. Massive for them here. IG losing is disastrous for their playoff chances. They really needed a lot of things to go right this week. They still can make it in. There still is absolutely a world in which, some combination of things allows them to end up making it in. But you have to remember, this is their final series of the year, and so they really, really, really needed to put themselves in a good spot to be able to pick up, a win here, and they just weren't able to do it. They end their season at 7-9, and that might just be a little bit too low to end up making the playoffs with RNG and WE kind of playing at least a little bit better than they have over the last couple of games. But let's talk about this series, because honestly, it was a lot of fun to watch. First thing to note, in the final series of the year, You Should Know Me is still not here. He is still sick as far as I'm aware. I know he was sick last week, and that's why he wasn't playing. I presume that is also why he is not playing in this one either. That means Nenny is still playing at top. Lucky for them, he was actually pretty good in this series, or at least he wasn't nearly the big problem on this team, and game 1 was an absolute banger, like a blast. Probably the best game of the week, the most fun game of the week if I had to be entirely honest. It was just both teams going back and forth and back and forth. And eventually BLG coming out on top because Yagal's LeBlanc just went absolutely disgusting in this game. All those people, I know I'm going on a little bit of a tangent here, but all of those people that were shit-talking Yagal for so much of the split, after the last, like, 3 weeks, where are you? Like, what happened to you? Did you wake up? Did you realize that 2022 wasn't just a dream that we all had, that JDG was real, and that Yagal actually is a really good player? Because here he is. This very much felt like a 2022 JDG Yagal kind of performance where he's helping out his jungler early game. He's making sure June on the Wukong gets super far ahead. And then he's just transitioning that lead into being a team fighting monster, just like he was last year. He's an easy choice for player of the series. I'll say that now. Dying once in a series with 95 combined kills is absolutely absurd. Yagal absolutely deserves player of the series here. One of the better performances that anybody has given all year long, in my opinion. That game 1 was so fun to watch from him. And then game 2 wasn't bad either on the Taliyah. He was still effective. Wasn't necessarily picking up the kills. This was definitely more of a early game JDG 2022 kind of performance where it's like, hey, June, you want all of my resources? Here you go. And then he's just 0-1-10, helping out his team. Everybody's ahead in gold at the end of the game. Just, this is the pinnacle of Yagal. This is exactly what you signed him for. And this kind of proves that I think a lot of the people that were doubting whether or not he'd be able to fit into this team, you know, he fits really, really well. Elk and On have obviously been great over the course of the split so far. Elk, in my opinion, sneaky MVP candidate. I don't think a lot of people are actually going to vote for him, but he's certainly in my conversation. That's something I'm going to think about, but On, I mean, what a coin flippy series from On. He may have been the single worst player in game 1. I mean, some of those blitz hooks were really good, but he also was just running it at points. Like, there were multiple moments where he was just actively running it on the blitzcrank, and then game 2 was basically the perfect Nautilus game. Like, it was almost flawless coming out from him. If Yagao didn't have the kind of game 1 that he had, On might have just gotten player of the series for that Nautilus game in game 2, but that's who he is. He's a little bit feast or famine, very coin flippy, but when that coin lands right, I mean, he's going to obliterate you. He's maybe the most talented support in the entire league. He really is that good. Elk and On are dangerous as a duo, and I think they're underratedly dangerous. I don't hear a lot of people bringing them up as one of the best bot lanes in the LPL. It's damn true, though. They definitely are. On Invictus's side, it's just not as good, right? Like, game 1 was super fun, and you had some good moments. On was doing a lot of damage in that late game on the Aphelios, and you go for something wild like Vigar support to be able to pull it out to try and maybe swing a game in your advantage, but there's just not really a lot that you can do when LeBlanc is blowing up your Aphelios basically instantly in a lot of these fights. And then you're relying on support Vigar and Lissandra to be able to carry your damage. It's just going to be kind of difficult to win those fights from that point on. And then game 2 was a little bit of a stomp. They just kind of got out early gamed by Jun's Lee Sin, and they really weren't able to recover from there. On was making some good plays. And anytime they would go for anything aggressive, it would just kind of be shut down. I did like Nenny in game 2. I thought his Malphite was pretty okay, but overall, it was just kind of them choked out, I would say. Dud of the series is going to go to Wink. I think you could realistically give this to On as well, if only because he was so integral to the team in game number 1, and yet he kind of ran it in some of these fights a little bit too much, just way too aggressive positioning. But I'm going to give it to Wink because the Vigar did not work in game 1, in my opinion. Probably the weakest member on the side of IG, and then, God, Aphelios Rakan in game 2 was obliterated. I mean, Nautilus hooks were point and click, and both of them were dying to it constantly. On and Wink had such a strong start to the split. They were so good, and I don't want to overreact to one bad game, but it's not really been one. It's been about 3 or 4 in a row, like 3 or 4 series in a row. They were really, really good up until that point, and so I don't want to sit here and say that On and Wink are some sort of bad bot lane, but it does feel that they've come back down to earth a little bit during this losing streak for IG. But obviously, Dove not really offering nearly as much as Yagao on the other side. Gideon just getting heavy out-jungled by June in that game 2. IG deserved to lose this series. Yes, game 1 was a lot of fun, and they put up a good fight, but they were clearly the worst of these two teams, in my opinion, and I think they're going to be walking away just hoping and praying that teams like Rare Atom can pick up some crazy, shocking wins over a team like RNG to keep their split and their playoff hopes alive. But for BLG on the other side, pretty good spot. I mean, this is going to be a top 6 team most likely, and that's a pretty decent spot for BLG to sit in, especially with how some of the middle of this split ended up going. I like this team. I think they're honestly a little bit underrated moving into playoffs. If Elkanon can carry this team kind of over the finish line, Yagao is plenty good, And Bin is certainly talented enough. He just hasn't had that breakout performance, I would say, in 2023. June is really the only one I'm worried about, but again, he's really good from ahead. As long as you can consistently get a lead on this team, I feel pretty good about BLG's chances, even against some of the tougher teams in the league. Moving on now to day number 4, and we kick day 4 off with another interesting series, obviously almost halfway through the final week of the season here, but still a lot to determine towards the bottom of the playoff standings, and that's definitely the case in this one, as we have one of the most important matchups of the week. We have Rare Adam taking on Royal Never Give Up, and RNG is able to pull out a massive win here. This confirms them in the playoffs. This officially eliminates Rare Adam. They had a very slim chance of being able to make it in if they won this, and then a bunch of tiebreakers ended up swinging their way. But RNG ends the season at 8-8, and they end up in the playoffs, which is absolutely huge for them. Obviously, if they end up missing, that is the most disastrous season they could have ever had. I don't know if RNG has ever missed the playoffs. In fact, I think they have not ever missed the playoffs in the LPL, but this was probably the closest they have ever come, or at least in recent memory. This was not a good regular season, but at the very least, they were able to pick up a win here, and they were able to secure themselves a playoff spot at 500. But how did they go about doing it? Well, we've got to start with my player of the series here, and that is going to go to Wei in the jungle. I've been very critical of Wei over the course of this split so far, because I honestly do think that he has been kind of bad for RNG. Like, there have been some moments where he's been fine. I certainly don't think that every game from him has been atrocious or anything like that, but he certainly hasn't been the pinnacle of consistency for RNG, and I find oftentimes, especially when they lose pressure in the early game, it's Wei just not really being able to keep up with whoever he's going against. Luckily, RA didn't do any scouting this week and decided to give him Vi 3 games in a row, the one champion he has actively been good at over the course of not only this year, but basically his whole career here for RNG, and guess what? He does really well on it. Massive surprise. I don't really know what to take away from this. It's good to see Wei be able to generate such a strong early game lead, both in game 1 and in game 3, but at the end of the day, like, you gotta be able to do it on multiple champions, and especially when we start getting into playoff conversations, I doubt that this team is going to be getting Vi a ton. I think my biggest concern with RNG throughout the regular season so far has been the synergy between Wei and Angel as players, and I think that wasn't necessarily alleviated in this series, even with Wei playing well. Wei is a player who does like to give resources over to somebody like a Xiaohu that he played really well with for many years, but Angel's just not that kind of player. Angel's not going to be someone that's going to be moving around the map and actively trying to create a ton of action in the early game. He's going to be playing, you know, to relatively just scale up in the mid to late game. That's kind of what he has been on Weibo and Suning over the past few years, and I just don't know if that necessarily meshes with how Wei wants to play the game. It doesn't feel like either has really adapted to the other. If anything, Angel's gotten a little bit more aggressive, but even then, I don't think it's by a ton here. I'm still waiting to see what these two are going to do against a team that's a little bit more competent at going against a position like this, especially when Wei is off his comfort. But at the very least, he was able to do well in this series. Gala and Ming have been really good. Again, they had some poor positioning moments. Gala in particular overstepped a couple of times in this series, but that's one of the things that I really do like about Gala, is that he's not afraid to go for plays. Again, you know, you don't want to be the guy that's just getting caught all the time, but you do want to be the guy that is actively trying to win the game for your team out of the bot lane position, especially when you've probably been the best player on the team over the course of the year so far. And so I'm not going to criticize him too much. It's kind of the opposite here, where I think Gala and Ming had a little bit of a down series, whereas Wei had a good series, and I'm not necessarily sure that is the accurate reflection of what RNG is going to be over the course of the playoffs and the split. But at the very least, winning this locks you into playoffs. You're not going to be making it out of that, like, top or bottom 4 in the playoffs. You know, you're not going to be a top 16, but at the very least, you're going to get the chance to, you know, play in the playoffs and see how far you can go. As for Rare Adam on the other side, technically they were still alive. When it came to playoffs here, there was a very weird scenario that could see them getting 10th because of game score and because of head-to-head tiebreakers and yada, 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 but they're not able to win this, and that does officially eliminate them. It's kind of hard to kind of talk about them in this. I feel like a lot of the discussion around this series is going to be centered on RNG, rightfully so, in my opinion. I think that this team kind of controlled the series, and, you know, even when they lost in game number 2, it was more about RNG kind of playing bad than RA playing good, but they have some talented players to move into summer with. I really do like Strive, and Assume and Southwind were actually kind of fine this series, especially in lane. I thought their laning stats were really good. Yes, they were playing Xayah into Kai'Sa and Zeri every game, which you just should be able to win. There really is no excuse for not being able to win that bot lane matchup, but they still won it. Like, that's still something good to take away. Unfortunately, their impact in the mid to late game was just not really there, and that's kind of a problem that Rare Atom has just had in general. They've had maybe the worst macro of any team in the entire league, maybe outside of Ultra Prime, but like they're right there with them in my opinion, and it just kind of takes a lot of this talent and makes it a lot more useless. Like, Cube had some good laning phases, but then he played Jackson to Kennen, and new Kennen looks pretty darn good, and Leon's great in the early game, but he has literally no idea what to do after 10 minutes into the game, and even then, sometimes even the early game's a little bit of a problem because he can get too aggressive. Like, there are just so many ifs about this Rare Atom team that makes me question whether or not they are going to be a team that can ever, hit that next level. My guess would probably be no. That's why I was lower on them going into the year. That's why I was lower on them going into the week. I had them 13th in my power rankings, even though they were competing for a playoff spot, and so not particularly surprising. Southwind's going to get done of the series. I don't think anybody on RA really played all that bad. Everybody had their moments. I think Strive, gameplay-wise in Game 3, was particularly the worst, but he generated a nice lead in that game. He just did pretty much nothing with it. I think Assume and Southwind were fine in lane, but some of those engages, especially towards the back half of that series on Leona, just not particularly good. I had to give it to somebody. I don't think Southwind was really all that bad, and I just had to give it to somebody on RA because I don't think anybody on RNG deserved it either, but they're just one of those teams that I'm just not particularly excited about. They have a couple of players that are interesting, but they've never really shown a desire or an ability to be able to put it together for any stretch of time. As for RNG on the other side, good to lock playoffs, but you've got a lot of work to do if you even want to get out of the first round in the LPL playoffs. This is certainly an organization that, has overperformed expectations when it came down to best of fives in the past, but this is definitely not the RNG that fans are used to, and they very realistically could run into troubles, going into playoffs. This series did not at all alleviate a lot of my doubts coming into that. And then moving on to our second series of day number 4, and this one I've got a lot to talk about because there certainly is a reaction to it. And, maybe mine might be a little bit different than a lot of other people's. Let's go ahead and talk about FunPlus Phoenix taking on Top Esports. And Top Esports finally pick up another series win. They end up winning this. They halt the, I think, 5-series losing streak that they had been on. Something ludicrous like that. They were all the way up in first or second place, and then they dropped all the way down basically to 500 on this massive losing streak. But they finally ended in their final season of the year. A pretty good time to end it right before playoffs, but it is against a pretty bad team. So what makes this series so interesting? Well, a substitution makes this series interesting. You do not often see teams like Top Esports make substitutions one series before the playoffs. I'm not exactly sure if this is going to last going into the playoffs, but Wayward coming back into the top lane. I am very intrigued about this. People who follow the channel have to know my feelings on Wayward. I actually was really high on his split last year in the LPL. He was my Rookie of the Year. I voted for him for Rookie of the Year. I absolutely thought he should have won it. And I had him in consideration. I actually think I might have given him an All-Pro nod near the bottom of the All-Pro section. He was a really good top laner last year in the regular season. He helped out Top Esports a lot on their, kind of road to being one of the best teams in the LPL, but obviously, he had a miserable Worlds. He went to the World Championships and was maybe the worst player in the group stage there, at least from a major region. And that lost him his job. He ends up getting replaced by Qingtian on this team. He doesn't play all year long, and he comes back in here and looks awesome. They're very two different players, I would say, in the top lane. Qingtian and Wayward, that is. Qingtian definitely more of a carry-oriented player. Wayward's someone who's going to be a lot more comfortable, I think, playing those tanks. He is still going to play aggressive. He's someone who is going to push forward on the Gragas, on the Gnar, but you can leave him on weak side a little bit more often, and I think it's going to be more viable as a strategy for you. And I want to say all of this to also say that I like Qingtian, and I think that he has gotten a pretty bad rap here for Top Esports. Has he been great over the past month? No, not really. Was he really good? Maybe the best top laner in the league over the first 2 months? Maybe. Like, he was certainly in the conversation. He was a top 3 top laner for me in the LPL for the first, 4 or 5 weeks of the season. And yeah, he was pretty shit over the last, 2 or 3 weeks, but do I want to give up on him? I don't know. Do I think Wayward is also really good? Yes, I think it's a good problem for Top Esports to have. They have 2 top laners that are solid, that are more than capable of playing at an LPL level. It's just, TES fans are insane. The LPL fans in general are insane. They will jump on anyone as soon as they have 1 or 2 bad games. All of a sudden, they are worthless and need to be replaced. Qingtian has kind of fallen into that, I think, recently, and, Wayward, I think, is the beneficiary of that, and he's going to get Player of the Series. He was really good in this one. I know I've talked a lot about him as a player, but he was really good in this series. His ults, especially towards the end of the game 2 on Gnar, were really good. He was 1v2ing the FPX bot lane at points in that game. Just really good stuff coming out from Wayward. It's what you want to see. He seems to be reinvigorated. Hopefully him being benched kind of put a fire under him, and he's going to play really well. I don't know if this is going to be the lineup going into playoffs for them, but it certainly worked in this one. I thought Rookie was a lot better. He was actually pretty good this week. He was easily this team's best player across the week, I would say. Even in their loss earlier in the week, it very much felt like Rookie was the one playing well. Aurelion Sol seems to be a pretty good pick for this team. Obviously, scaling is going to be good for any team that feels like they can survive the early game, and this is a team that has really struggled with macro. Aurelion Sol makes macro so much easier because it's just fight. Like, you just fight towards the back half of the game and you probably win. Add that with like a Zeri or whatever, it makes it super easy. Tian was a little bit more coherent, a little bit less coin flippy in the series. That's a positive. Jackie Love and Mark certainly had their moments where they, you know, looked good. They had moments where they looked kind of bad as well, but I would say overall, Top Esports definitely looking like an upgrade to what they have been over the past few months. I'm not sure if this is sustainable, but this was a pretty decent look for them. As for FPX, I mean, this team kind of sucks. Zhao Lao was in the top lane. They've been swapping out between him and Fearness basically over the course of the split so far. Neither have really stepped up. I think Zhao Lao has been worse as a player. I'm going to give him dud of the series here. Goes into Wayward, who was clearly motivated, and he's just not able to hold up in that top lane matchup. I like Zhao Lao as a player. I think he's fine. Like, he's a lower mid-tier LPL top laner, but Wayward had something to prove in this series, and he clearly went out and proved it. Hacker wasn't particularly good in the jungle. The only player that I think really showed up, and I know it's almost becoming a meme at this point that I'm saying this, was Care on FPX. Like, I like Care a lot, and I thought he played, you know, Cass and Kassadin really well. I think that, you know, he was involved in a lot. The team kind of played through him a bit. He wasn't mispositioned, and he was getting a lot of damage out. He just didn't really have a lot of backup. People are going to look at LWX's scoreline and say that he had a good series, but his positioning was just awful, like it has been the whole split. Like, there really is no excuse for that. People see some of the pop-off plays, and they look at the numbers, and they look at the score lines, and they don't watch the games. Like, I hate to say it, like, people don't watch LWX's positioning and see how, you know, good teams are just going to be able to completely abuse him as a player. That's why I'm a little bit lower on him and what he's been able to offer. But overall, FPX was never a team that was going to be in playoff contention. They were out pretty early on into the split, and it's all just about building something for summer, right? Like, this is a really good organization, one that has won quite a bit in the past, but I don't really see where you go up from here in terms of the team. You've got a lot of veterans on this team, not a lot of players that I think are just needing a little bit more experience at this level. A lot of players who have been given a lot of time to grow and haven't necessarily done it. Obviously, players like that can take a leap, but maybe it's not expected. Roster changes might be imminent for FPX. I just don't know where exactly you would go. The only player that I would consider to be untouchable would be Care in the mid lane. I think you've got something in him. Probably LWX as well, and Chocho if you feel like those two have nice development. But topside is definitely up for debate, and that was shown off in this series. As for Top Esports, you're in a decent spot. 9-7 is not the worst thing in the world. You might have to play in round 1 of the playoffs, depending on how the rest of this week goes, but that honestly might be better for you. This team needs confidence more than anything else right now. You put them in a series against a team they can actually beat in the first round. That might actually be something that can be the catalyst for them going a lot further in the playoffs than maybe people are expecting with how they've played in recent months. Moving on now to day number 5 in the final week of the LPL. We're really getting to the nitty-gritty now. We're going to be finding out where these teams stand. Maybe not so much in this one, but in some of these future series. In this one, just a little bit more of a reassurance. We had LGD Gaming taking on LNG Esports. Always fun when these two teams face off against each other, but it's LNG, predictably, who was able to come out on top in their final series of the year to put their final record at 13-3. A really good split from LNG. I mean, you can just talk about how this team had lower expectations for a lot of people going into the year, me included. And when you go back and rewatch and re-listen, especially to my analysis on them in my preseason predictions, I talked about how I really believed in Tarzan and Scout, but everything else on this team had me with some major question marks. I thought Hang should be fine, but LP and Zika in particular, I was not exactly sure how they were going to perform. Well, blow that out of the water. I mean, they are awesome. This is legitimately one of the best teams in the entire world right now. And everything that you could have hoped for when, you know, you put all these players together has absolutely come true, in my opinion. Player of the series in this one is going to go to Hang in the support position. It almost feels like he's gotten a little bit overshadowed, and I think that that's a fair thing to say. I think a lot of, you know, rightfully so, a lot of attention has gone on to Scout and Tarzan, but you know, even LP, I think, is getting a lot of, you know, notice because I think people are looking out for him to be kind of a weakness for this team. And when he does show up and play really well, you know, a lot of people are like, oh, so he's not bad at all. So those are kind of the three that, you know, get a lot of the attention for LNG. But I think Hang has secretly been, really consistent over the course of the year. One of the more interesting supports in the entire LPL. He's going to get player of the series because he actively piloted a Leona and made it positive, which is maybe the first time that I've seen that in 2023. This champion has not had the best of luck and the best of success at the pro level this year so far, but Hang played it really well. You're going into a pretty weak bot lane of LPC and Jinzhao. I just realized it's LNG versus LGD, and it's LPC versus LP. There's so many weird things in this matchup that are kind of wild, but they were going into kind of a weak bot lane on the side of LGD, and they took advantage of that. They were able to generate some early leads on the Lucian Nami, and then in Game 2, they just kind of dominated on the Zeri Leona. You typically don't want to play something like Leona with Zeri. You're not going to have a ridiculous amount of prio in the early game to be able to capitalize on Leona's engages, and Zeri doesn't really need time, especially towards the back half of the game when she becomes strong. She just needs someone to keep her alive, but didn't really matter. Never got to the point in the game where it was ever going to matter because Game 2 was an utter stomp coming out from LNG, but overall, the whole team looking good. LP was incredibly solid. Scout was efficient. Tarzan was perfect in this series. I mean, he was awesome on the Vi in both games, being able to establish an early lead, especially in that game number 1, being able to take down that Elise over and over again. Even in Game 2, he was able to generate such a large lead that really LGD had nothing to do. And then Zika is solid in the top lane. LNG is really showing that they are a pretty complete roster and a pretty complete team. If this team continues to play at this level for the entirety of the rest of the year, I mean, they could legitimately be one of the most dangerous teams in the entire world. As for LGD on the other side, they were looking pretty good going into this week. They felt kind of like a hot team that was not going to make playoffs, but was at least going to show that they could be competitive. That fell apart this week. This was one of their worst weeks in a very long time, and that's kind of capitalized on by the fact that Jinzhao's going to get another dud of the week here, or another dud of the series, I should say. Playing Tahm Kench can be fine. You're going to rack up the death numbers, but typically that's not a problem. But when you are this out of position all the time, basically in every single engage, and not really contributing anything even offensively at all, you're not going to have a very good analysis coming out from me. Jinzhao's going to get the dud of the series from just being out-pressured by Hang in that support matchup. LP was basically just destroying him in terms of auto attacks, and there really was nothing that he could do. I don't think Tahm is as good as people say he is in the support position right now, and I think that was kind of shown off throughout the week and in this series. I also think Meteor was particularly bad in the jungle. He kind of has been over the course of the year. I've been very low on him as a jungler in 2023, which sucks because I love his previous work on BLG, but it just wasn't meant to be in 2023. It feels like he is a little bit past his prime. He was just completely destroyed by Tarzan in the jungle matchup, 2 games of Elise, and he gets almost nothing off in the early game of either of them, and so what's even really the point of the pick? You're going with the Tristana in the mid lane to try and capitalize off of that, but you're going into Scout, so of course he's not going to be giving over easy resources. Xiaoshu, who's kind of been your saving grace in the top lane, the one that kind of facilitated a lot of the positive movement that this team has been making, was not good in this series. And, just a little small thing about Xiaoshu, he was pretty bad to start the year as well. He just had that really good stretch over the middle of the split, and so, he's not a perfect player. I see a lot of people saying that some top teams should pick him up. Not exactly sure if he's quite there yet, like ready to compete for a title, but he probably will be by the end of the year, and so maybe give him a little bit more time on this team, but, he's a solid player, just not as good with the rest of the team around him, so LGD's not great. I mean, again, talent-wise, they're near the bottom of the standings, but at the very least, they were able to stay relatively competitive with LNG in this one, and that's really, I guess, what you're celebrating, is that LNG is able to confirm their 13-3 split. Technically, there is still a possibility, I think, for them to get the 2 seed, but that would require EDG to lose later in the week to ThunderTalk, or I guess later in the day to ThunderTalk, which is possible, but not likely. So LNG kind of hoping and praying for ThunderTalk to step up. Either way, I mean, this team will happily take a top 3 finish, I think, especially with where they were projected in the preseason. Scout's looking like an MVP. Tarzan had a great series. Hang is awesome. LP and Zika have not been weak links at all. This team is legit, and they're very fun to watch. And now moving on to a series that definitely has playoff implications in the second series of day number 5 here. We had a matchup between ThunderTalk Gaming and Edward Gaming that EDG was able to win in 2-0 fashion, and that's a big win for EDG because what it does is it clinches 13-3 and it clinches a 28-11 record, which means they have clinched the 2nd seed in the LPL going into playoffs. That is absolutely massive for them, obviously, because top 2 seeds are the most buys in the tournament. It means that you get the most amount of rounds to safety, which is massive for this team. It means that you are also the only 2 teams to guarantee losers bracket no matter what. It means that even if you lose your first year of the playoffs, you still get another chance, a second life, which is massive for this team. And EDG is really, really good, and they absolutely deserve it. You know who has really stepped up this year? Leave in the bot lane. He's going to get my player of the series here against ThunderTalk. He was phenomenal in game number 2 here. This Xayah game was legitimately unreal how well he played in it. I mean, you can talk about Mako as well. Like, I don't want to fault Mako or anything. I don't want it to seem like his importance is not being valued here. Obviously, I'm a huge fan of Mako. I've been a huge fan of Mako for a long time. You can check my channel's history for that, but Leave was the superstar here for EDG, and he for sure deserves player of the series. A great showing from a young AD carry who has really just ramped up. Like, my comparison for him, maybe not in terms of playstyle, but just in terms of narrative, is absolutely pays on Gen G over in the LCK. They're just so similar, both of them coming into teams replacing, you know, arguably the two best AD carries in the world in Ruler and Viper, respectively, and actively stepping in and being focal points that their good team, you know, they're near the top of the standings team, can actually play through. Just impressive stuff coming out from EDG in general. Like, playing, the way that they play around Leave is so intense. His laning is really solid. He's able to generate leads on his own, but it's his aggressive team fighting that really puts him above a lot of his contemporaries in that position and truly makes him, like, legit one of the best AD carries in the LPL. And I don't really see the train slowing down soon, if I'm being honest. I think he's going to continue to be a major positive for this team, especially because he gets to continue to play with Mako down in the support position, who, big shocker, continues to be one of the best supports in the entire world, because he's arguably the greatest support of all time, or he's the very least in the conversation. He's a really, really good player. The 2 games of Renata here were huge, especially the laning phase is really impressed. Renata's one of those champions that sometimes doesn't have the same kind of laning prowess that you would expect from a kind of ranged champion with a hook, if you will, but, you know, I think Mako piloted her just like any other, you know, poke range mage, right? Any Lux or any Morgana or anything like that. Mako just creates so much pressure on his own with his gameplay that it was really impressive. The bot lane of EDG is special. They are very good. They are incredibly strong, and they're going to win a lot of games for this team. All HJJ, Fofo, they were still really good for EDG, but it really was about the bot lane in this series for them. As for ThunderTalk on the other side, obviously it's a frustrating loss to have, but it's not the worst loss in the world. You're sitting at 8-7. You still got another series later in the week, and it doesn't really matter if you win or lose it. You're locked for playoffs either way, but obviously the better seed you get, the better you're at. There's a chance that a team like RNG could potentially be sitting at 9th place in the standings. You probably don't want to play a team like RNG in the first round of the playoffs. That's not ideal, but what ended up happening in this series, and who am I giving dud of the series to? Well, maybe controversially a bit here, I'm going to give it to UCal in the mid lane. I like UCal. I think he's been having a pretty good split. I do think that his second half has been significantly less impactful than his first half of the split was, or at least that stretch over, like, week 3 to week, I don't know, 5 or 6. That was really, really good for him. Everything after that has just not been particularly great. He's been solid, but he's gone up against better talent, and it's really shown that he is, you know, probably a mid-tier mid laner, not a top-tier mid laner in the region, which is unfortunate. I've never really been impressed by the Vygar. There have been very few instances that pick has been pulled out and has, like, legitimately been super influential in the game. Maybe I'm just missing it, but it hasn't seemed like a pick that has really worked all that well at the pro level yet, and I don't really think UCal was doing any damage across these games. I think you could very realistically also give this to Beishwan. In the jungle, though, he has definitely been a little bit feast or famine for this team. I know a lot of people are calling for Xiao Huangren, but Beishwan, to me, is still a pretty good player. Definitely one that is a big part of why TT is in the position they are in right now. But overall, I think we've just kind of learned what ThunderTalk is as a team. They're solid. They're not great. They're not bad. They're just going to be fine, right? They are a mid-tier team in the LPL. Definitely playoff worthy, which we've seen when they go up against some of the teams that are below them in the standings, but probably not a team that's going to be competing with teams like EDG at the top of the standings. And so, credit to ThunderTalk. They've made their first playoffs ever with this split, but it might not be a super long run if they play like they did here today. And then for EDG on the other side, this is a team that very much wants to go to MSI. Like, this is a team that is going to be looking not only to just be top 2, but to win the entire split. In general, they absolutely have the talent to do so. It's all just going to be about whether or not they can consistently get there with some of their young players. And then moving on now to our weekend series, our 2 weekend days. Usually it's 2 super days, but because of the way the schedule ended up working out, you know, in the last couple of weeks here, we have a regular Sunday, only 2 games or 2 series, I should say, on that Sunday, but it is still a Super Day on Saturday, and that's what we're jumping into right now as we kick it off with a matchup between 2 locked-in playoff teams. It doesn't really affect standings, I think, at all, but it is super interesting to see these 2 teams go one-on-one. We had Bilibili Gaming taking on OMG, and OMG picks up another really big victory. This team just continues to overperform expectations. They continue to actually be able to take down some of the top teams in the entire region. And honestly, like, this team is very close to being considered just, like, legit a top 4 or 5 team in the LPL. Like, they are scary, and they're clicking on all levels right now, which is so good to see. I got a lot of backlash in my preseason predictions for putting this team at number 6, above a bunch of, other team favorites, a bunch of others that I think a lot of people expected to do rather well. I think I've been pretty good on that, honestly. I feel like I've kind of hit it out of the park in terms of where I predicted OMG. They might even be better than what I was anticipating because they looked awesome in this series. They did lose game number 1, but they had some nice bounce back in games 2 and 3. Bounces back? They bounced back nicely. Sorry, my grammar is dying, I guess. They bounced back nicely in games 2 and 3. They took them rather handily and were able to close out the series. Player of the series for me felt like kind of a no-brainer. It's going to go to Aki in the jungle. Again, I cannot stress enough just how important he has been towards OMG's rise to the top of the standings this split. Shanji and Cream and Abel had been good in previous years. They had been solid. There's a reason they made playoffs in 2022 and summer of 2022 as well. But for this team to really hit that next level, they needed their jungler to really take that next leap, and boy did he. Honestly, this is the best an OMG player has looked in this era of the team, and that is definitely saying something for as high as I feel on the solo laners on OMG in particular. For Aki to have an all-pro caliber season in the jungle right now, it's just ridiculously impressive from a player that I was honestly willing to write off going into this year as a player who's just kind of mid-tier LPL jungler, not someone who I expect to be able to make that big leap, is probably going to be fine enough. He's not going to hold your team back, but he's not exactly going to propel them forward. That's just not the case. That is not what Aki was for OMG at all this year, and not what he has been so far. If he's going to be able to keep that up, if he's genuinely one of the best junglers in the LPL, like, this is a dangerous team. This is a world's caliber team, and that's awesome to say about this roster. You also have to talk about Game 3's draft, and mostly Shanji in the top lane. Obviously, he had a wonderful game on the Rumble in Game 2. It's one of his signature picks alongside the Shyvana, which I guess is just not meta enough for him to be able to pull it out right now. But pulling out the Victor top in Game 3, I can remember Victor top. I want to say it was 2020 Worlds. Maybe it was 2018, 2019. It was some World Championships where, Iceborne Gauntlet Victor top was unbelievably broken, and everybody in Korea was pulling it out, and we saw Licorice and everybody playing it on the world stage. Shanji clearly got comfortable with the pick and was willing to play it into something like Kennen that usually has that range advantage in the top lane, but it absolutely worked out. I know a lot of people are going to be talking about Shanji after this series because of the unorthodox AP picks that he's willing to bring up into the top lane, but hey, if it works, it works. That's all that really matters. Victor top is definitely an innovation, and it's going to keep teams on their toes. For their last series of the year, it's definitely an intriguing pick because now you got to worry about that in the playoffs. If Shanji's willing to pull that out, it's at least got to be something that you prep for if you face them in the playoffs, and so really fun to see them pull that out. I thought Abel and PP God were really good as well. Abel just needs to get on Aphelios like all the time. I know Samira is his signature pick, and it definitely is, but Samira's not nearly as competitive in pro, like, consistently as a pick like Aphelios is, and Abel is so good at Aphelios that I just want to see him play it all the time. He always has the right guns. He's always in the right position. He's constantly dealing damage. He's great. Him and PP God have good synergy, even if they're not the focal point of where this team wants to run a lot of its resources. They're just great. Basically no negatives for me to give OMG. They pass with flying colors. As for BLG on the other side, they're still good. Like, being able to win game 1 here was solid, and I think Elk in particular played really well in this series. I think you could talk about Yagao having a lot of positive influences. They just were a little bit outclassed on the top side of the map, in my opinion. I think you can talk about June not being particularly good in this series. He probably should get dud of the series. I think he was probably the most detrimental towards BLG's cause, and, I've said this over the course of the year. I am low on June now. I was really high on him going into the year. I thought him getting picked up by a big team was a great move. I thought he was kind of the standout player on those Invictus Gaming teams for a lot of years. I thought he was going to be able to mesh really well with this team, but his feast or famine style has been mostly famine over the course of the year for BLG. Even in their wins, he's just been fine. He might be a liability come playoffs because he just kind of got out-jungled by Aki in both of the final 2 games of this series, like, heavily. But my dud of the series is actually going to go to On in the support position. It was off this series. That is for sure. We've talked about him being very coin flippy, being very feast or famine. I know I use that term way too much, but it perfectly describes On. He's going to have some games where he's utterly dominant. He's going to have some games where he walks up, misses every ability, and just immediately dies. And unfortunately, that's the kind of On you were getting in this series. It doesn't really change my opinion of him at all. I still really like him as a support because at least he's willing to try and make some of these plays happen. He's a playmaker, but sometimes those plays are not meant to be made, and unfortunately, this series was a little bit of a problem with that. He's always been a little bit poor from behind, but luckily for him, him and Elk are really good in lane together, and they have a great synergy, and they've been able to generate a lot of leads together, so I'm not super concerned that this is going to be a long-running issue, but for BLG, they're a good team. Losing this series wasn't exactly enlightening for me. Like, it's not exactly something that I feel super good about, but at the end of the day, like, you've already locked yourself into a pretty good playoff spot somewhere in that 5-6 range with this loss, and so you're not really too concerned. As long as you're going to be able to play at the level you know you can play at with your MVP candidate in the bot lane, you're probably going to be fine, at least in the early matchups of the playoffs. And as for OMG, honestly, they might be in the same boat. This is a team that, you know, I was really high on going into the year, and then I started to doubt them because they were ascending a little bit faster than maybe I expected, but I feel like a lot of their progress is pretty sustainable and is something that I could expect to continue. Shanji and Aki in particular have been good in recent weeks. Cream, I think, you know, if he has a good day, he can beat anybody in the league. Same for Abel and PP God. This team is very dangerous. You cannot take them lightly, even though they are rather inexperienced at the playoff level. Then moving on to our second series of day number 6 here, and I'm going to keep this one a little bit brief because there's really not a lot to talk about when it comes to these 2 games. We had Ultra Prime taking on JD Gaming, and it was over quicker than I could even breathe. I mean, this was 2 20-minute games. Good for JDG. And here's the thing. I saw a lot of people saying, like, wow, how insane is it that JDG was able to do this? How crazy is it that JDG did this to a team like Ultra Prime, who, yes, are bad, but they did this at the LPL level? This isn't the first time they've done this year. This isn't the second time they've done this year. I don't even think it's the third time they've done this year. They've had so many series that have just been complete washes because they are utterly destroying everyone on the enemy team that, you know, honestly, this doesn't surprise me at all. When JDG wins, they win harder than anybody in the world. That includes T1. Like, as good as T1 is, their highs don't match JDG's highs. And that's why this team has been at number 1 in the power rankings for me since day number 1, is because even when they lose, I still have to think back on the wins where they won a series in a combined 40 minutes. Like, great. You know what? It took less than an hour for you to prove that you were significantly better than the team that you were playing against, and no one ever questioned it. And that was the case in this series. I'll do a little bit of a deep dive, I guess, but there really isn't a lot of analysis I could possibly give you on this game. JDG was that much better, and we knew it going into it. It's the best team versus the worst team. My player of the series is going to go to Knight. I think some people are going to give it to Kanavi, rightfully so. Some people are going to give it to Missing, rightfully so. But I'm going to give it to Knight, also rightfully so. Everybody was so good in this series that it didn't really matter, but Knight is just different. Like, he is just a monster. He obliterated Forge in the 1v1, and then he was just everywhere else on the map destroying people. This was a deathless, a destructive, I mean, unbelievable series coming out from him. I know I get a lot of hate, or at the very least I did in the world cycle last year for being so high on Knight, like top 1 player in the world on Knight, but it's performances like these that just make me go, yeah, I'm right. Like, I don't know what else you guys are watching. He's really freaking good at League of Legends. Like, I don't know what you want me to say. Knight's really good. You know who else is good? Kanavi. And that's, I'm not going to say it's been up for debate, because he's still been really good this split, but it hasn't exactly been, like, jammed down your throat over the course of the split, but this performance kind of proves it for me and for a lot of other people. Kanavi's really, really good at the game of League of Legends, and it's good to see that he's a little bit back on form. He did struggle a bit in the middle part of the season when JDG was losing games. A lot of that was Kanavi giving over a lot of early pressure to the enemy jungler, but when he's able to win early, like, it is just a wrap. Like, no one else closes out games quite like Kanavi does in the jungle. It's so crazy how Ruler was like a non-factor. He was the tower taker in this series, the designated tower taker on Aphelios, the split-pushing Aphelios, and then Missing got to team fight a lot. The Renata plays, the Annie plays, especially in game number 2. Super fun to watch. I think in most series, I would give player of the series to Missing. This was maybe his best series of the entire year. He was really good here. And then 369 is just so solid on the top lane, although it didn't really matter. There was zero action on the top side of the map. JDG's good. What else do you want me to say? Ultra Prime's not good. What else is there to say? This team sucks. I know they were able to take a game earlier on in the week. That's an improvement from what they've been able to do recently, but this team is just not very good. They are outmatched in basically every single lane. Forge coming in clearly is not settled yet, and playing against Knight Syndra is certainly not a good way to get settled. Doggo's all right, but everybody else on this team is just not LPL caliber. Ning and Baolan in particular are just not LPL caliber right now as players. Ning got obliterated in this series. I wanted to give him dead of the series, but then I watched Baolan play Ashe, and I'm like, never mind. I simply have to give this to Baolan. Just a miserable series coming out from both of the former IG players, both of the former world champions. At this point, I wouldn't be shocked if this team like actively just goes a different direction in summer. I don't know who they have down in their LDL team, but I can't imagine it's going to be that much worse, and I don't think Ning and Baolan are going to get that much better. Maybe I'm wrong. Obviously, these players can continue to improve, but this split was miserable for both of those two. I think you can make a strong case that they're just not going to be valuable pieces to a team even remotely trying to contend for a playoff spot in 2023. I think Harry in the top lane's just kind of been meh as well. Really no positive moments that I can remember. He's fine mechanically, and he's had some solid, I guess, like, individual plays, but, like, when you're talking about series, like, I can't remember an impact that he had on any of them. Really, the only player who has influenced them at all in terms of their wins is Doggo. When Doggo plays well, this team is able to win. When he doesn't, this team loses. I think Doggo is honestly pretty good, and I feel bad that he's trapped with some of the worst players in the entire league right now, but this Ultra Prime team is just an absolute disaster. It feels like no matter what players this organization buys, they all turn to shit. Basically, immediately after. Elk, Zoom, not that Zoom was good before that, but like, you know, Hacker, they already had him, but you know what I mean? Like, now Ning and Baolan, it just doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. This is a graveyard of talent, and I, for one, would want to stay off this organization as much as possible, but I predicted this going into the season. I saw a lot of people saying this team was going to contend for playoffs. I was like, no way, and that turned out to be right, but even I couldn't have predicted how bad they were going to be. As for JDG, this is the best team in the LPL when they're clicking, and it's not close. If they play this way against every team in the league, they win. Period. End of story. I know they're not going to dominate like this, but if this team is able to play with this kind of confidence and this kind of aggression, like, even good teams aren't going to be able to stop this level of aggro. Like, it is so difficult to deal with all of these players at once. And JDG, if they're able to get it done, you know, I mean, they have the talent to breeze their way to an LPL trophy into a really dangerous place at MSI. And then moving on to our third series of day number 6, and this one is incredibly important as it will decide who the final team in the playoffs will be. We had Team WE taking on Ninjas in Pyjamas, and WE does get the job done. They are able to pick up the win in this series, and they're able to lock themselves in as the final team in the playoffs in the LPL. Congratulations to WE. They absolutely deserve it with the run that they were going on towards the back half of the split. Some major wins over some actually good teams to get here, and I do think they played well in this series. A couple of players that I'm really excited to shout out. A player that I'm maybe not as excited to shout out on the side of WE, but at the end of the day, they made it, and that's really all that matters. Player of the series for me is going to go to Shanks in the mid lane. If you followed my channel, you know how highly I think of Shanks. I think he's an incredibly talented player who's a great laner, ridiculously mechanically talented, knows how to generate his own leads, especially if left to his own devices in a 1v1 in the mid lane. However, he does have his flaws. He's not exactly a great team fighter. I would consider his decision-making towards the back half of games a little poor, but if you get a good team around him that is able to kind of control him and get him into a good spot, he can be a very, very dangerous player to actually have to deal with, and NIP had no answer. He was really good in game number 1 on the LeBlanc, just wasn't able to put it away. The poke really wasn't working, but you get him onto these more sustain-oriented, you know, frontline mages, the Sylas, the Ryze, something that can be a little bit more aggressive in terms of how he wants to play these fights, and it really works out. Shanks is an absolute blast to watch. He's the best player on WE. To me, it's not even particularly close, and he's a big reason why this team is sitting at 500 and in the playoffs right now. Without Shanks, I do not think this team comes close to a playoff berth. Big ups to the mid laner. He did it. He finally got his team out of purgatory that he himself was stuck in on the 0-16 WE team last year. It obviously wasn't just him, though. He had talent on this team. He had players to work with. Hang in the jungle was so important towards WE this split, both for good and for bad. He had some incredibly good games, especially early games where he was able to generate leads for his laners, and they could transition them into the mid game, and you could close it out relatively cleanly. But he also had some games where he just got completely blasted, and it completely took over the game, and WE WWE had no chance of winning. That's the kind of player that Hang is. A lot of the game is kind of dictated on his play, and luckily for them, he was good in this series. In my opinion, he was better than Shadow on that Lee Sin in the early game. Shadow wanting to go for more, scaling-oriented options. Couple of games of Maokai, a game of Viego here. It's just not going to be able to work out if Hang does get that early lead, especially if he gets it onto his bot lane or his mid lane. Then it becomes a lot more difficult to actually utilize those Maokai and Viego picks to actually do anything in the mid to late game. So credit to Hang, credit to Hope and Awandi, who were solid. Hope was so fed in game 1, and then he went back to being a bad team fighter just like he was earlier in the week. I'm super frustrated with that. It's not entirely his fault. We'll get to that, but I'm getting concerned, right? Hope's positioning, especially in the mid game, has definitely been concerning over the course of the week, and that's something that good teams in the playoffs are going to be able to take advantage of. And then Awandi's been fine. I feel like he's maybe been a little bit over-aggressive trying to follow up with Hope, but at the end of the day, if Hope kind of dials it in, I imagine Awandi will also look a lot better for that. The only player on WE that I have major question marks about is Bubu in the top lane. How can it not be Bubu in the top lane? Obviously, I've been very harsh. Like, I'm not even going to say critical. I'm going to say harsh. I've been harsh on Bubu over this time on the channel. I called him the single worst player in the LPL in 2022, and I don't think it was particularly close. I thought he was getting slightly more competent this year, but the wheels have fallen off in the last 3 weeks of the season. He's been the worst top laner again in the league over the last 3 weeks, and he did his best to cost WE this series. I mean, he got blasted in game number 1, and it was entirely his fault. They finally put him back on a meatball in game 2 where he can just sit back and not pay attention on the Gragas. And then, Renekton, he was 0-2-0 in their win, in their 30-minute 11-5 win in that game. So credit to Bubu. He did his job, which is get out of the way of the actually good players, but he's going to get done of the series because he was the single worst player in this series. And I don't even think it was particularly close. This WE team is not going to go far in playoffs if Bubu is there in the top lane. I know there aren't a lot of superstar top laners in the LPL, but Bubu doesn't really stand up to anybody. And that was really the case in this series. As for NIP on the other side, I'm a big fan of where this team is headed, if only just because they are so much more competent than they were at the beginning of the split when this team was utterly disastrous. They are now just a mediocre team. They're not a giga-awful team like they were for a lot of the split. That's why they were 16th in my power rankings, is because this team had, no pressure. Photic and Juo were doing fine, and honestly, they had some pretty good games, but Jungle was losing every game. Mid lane was losing every game. It just didn't matter. And those two positions getting absolutely blasted every game made the team not very good. Big surprise. There were some good performances, though, in this series, even though they lost. Invincible is definitely the one that's going to pop into a lot of people's minds. Again, there's that one guy on Reddit that in every single thread that you go into about NIP, or even just about the LPL, he's posting, how absurd it is that Rich isn't on this team and doesn't have isn't playing. I've explained why I think that mindset is kind of harmful towards NIP, because they're just very different players. Rich is going to give you solid gameplay, not necessarily outstanding gameplay, someone who's pretty bad in lane, but is a decent team fighter, someone who's going to be relatively stable for you, but isn't going to move the needle. But Invincible is someone who can move the needle. He's incredibly mechanically talented. He's had some fantastic games over the course of the split. He hasn't been able to put it together in, a lot of games in a row, but he's still young, and I actually like him a lot more than some of the other young top lane prospects in the league, and he had a great series. He dominated Bubu all 3 games. I mean, he was dominant in game 1, basically single-handedly won game 1 on the Gragas, challenged him by going Jackson game 2, which Bubu promptly declined by going for Gragas as the answer to that, and then he got super fed in that game. And then the Cassante was much more effective and much more relevant than the Renekton, even if he wasn't perfect. Invincible just had a really good series, and I know a lot of people are going to attribute that to Bubu, but this isn't the first series that Invincible has been really good for NIP. There is a real player on our hands here, and I think he's going to prove a lot of people wrong next split, in my opinion. Shadow, Dream, Photic, Juo, they were all fine. They were all relatively good as well, but NIP just didn't really have it today. WE was definitely the better team. I think the series was definitely in their hands. They kind of controlled the pacing, and NIP was just kind of following along. They didn't really have the talent to be able to fight back after game number 1. Photic wasn't exactly as aggressive as I would have wanted him on the Aphelios, which sometimes is a good thing, but in this case, I would have liked to see a little bit more. Dream was fine. Not necessarily a bad series, just not a perfect one. Shadow was a little bit cautious. I understand why on the scaling picks, but he just got outscaled in almost every single game. And then Juo was just playing engagers and never really found good targets. Overall, NIP tried, but at the end of the day, WE was simply the better team. And they're going to be moving on to playoffs now. They are likely, depending on how the final day goes, going to play a team like Top Esports in the first round. Not exactly a great matchup, but certainly one that is winnable for a team that has already defied so many expectations. And that's going to bring us to our final day of LPL action here in the final week of the LPL regular season in spring, and we kicked it off with a matchup to determine seeding here in the playoffs. We had Anyone's Legend taking on ThunderTalk Gaming, and ThunderTalk does pick up the win. They head to 9-7, and that means they get side selection in their first round matchup, which is good. It's nice. It doesn't change too much, but it does give them a little bit of an advantage. They don't have to face a team like Top Esports. Now they only have to face a prestigious organization like Royal Never Give Up. But we'll go ahead and talk about that in a bit. Let's talk about what ThunderTalk did in this series. Well, player of the series for me is going to go to their mid laner, UCal. I was a little bit harsh on him earlier on in the episode, if only because it felt like the second half of his split just wasn't nearly as explosive as the first half of his split, especially that run where they really started to pick things up. They obviously started 0-2, but I think they went like 6-2 after that, something ludicrous. Maybe it was like 4-2, 5-2, somewhere around there, right? And UCal was awesome in that run. He was one of the best mid laners in the entire region. It unfortunately just didn't really hold up over the course of the entire split. I thought he bounced back really well in this series, though. Obviously, going into AL is not exactly the hardest challenge in the world, but they've been playing a lot better as of recent. They're certainly not a team that you can overlook. I think they've won like 7 or 8 of their series game ones, which is absurd, first of all, like for this team to be 3-12 and have 13 wins on the season. It's just not entirely predictable, but for UCal in particular, he's someone who I think really wants to get off to early starts in his series leads, and so I was kind of interested to see how game 1 would go. Luckily, TT was able to break the AL curse. They were actually able to take game number 1, and UCal was a big reason for that. Obviously, big credit to Beishuan in the same vein. He was awesome in that game number 1, but UCal, Yao Yao, those are the players that I'm really looking at as ThunderTalk's like big advantages in this series, and I definitely think that ThunderTalk played really solid, and the UCal in particular played solid. I think ASOL as a pick is something that we're going to see a lot more of in the LPL playoffs. I think scaling just generally gets better once you get to a playoff time where players are a little bit less willing to go for these crazy risky plays because they know that if they lose, their season is over, and so I think, scaling picks typically become a little bit more valuable in that time, at ASOL is just one of the strongest scaling picks in the entire game right now, but Beishuan's been really good. I know he's been a little bit up and down, but I'm very high on him as a player, and I think he can be a really solid jungler in this league, like a playoff caliber jungler. It's going to be interesting to see him finally get the chance to prove it in the playoffs. This will be his first playoff experience, but him and UCal seem to have some nice chemistry together. If they get a nice run of form going, like this is a team that genuinely could take games off of some really good jungle mid duos, just purely from playing at a high level. His game 1 was really solid. Even his game 2, not a huge fan of the Xin Zhao pick. I don't think it really fits into what this team is going for in the second draft, but at the very least, like, he's shown that he can play it. It's something you have to at least consider as part of his champion pool. And Beishuan's a good player. I think if him and UCal are on the same page going into playoffs, that's going to increase their chances a lot. And then, of course, Wanfeng and Yao Yao. Wanfeng's stat line looks really good. I don't really think he did a whole lot in this series. Like, he capitalized on the situations that were presented to him, but he wasn't creating a ton down in the bot lane. This team was not investing a ton down into the bot lane. Yao Yao, however, was really making a lot of plays. Really fun series coming out from him on the Rakan. One of the more interesting support series I've seen in a while. I love him as a player. I talked about him a ton in 2022 about how when he entered ThunderTalk, their fortunes and their, ability to win games completely changed because that's just the kind of player that he is. I was really frustrated to see him not be playing at the beginning of the year for Xinlu, but they finally put him in. They went on a massive win streak with him, and he's proven them right so far. He is one of the most fun supports to watch in the entirety of the world, and he continues to be that. Great macro ideas from him. He's great at roaming. He's a little bit worse, I would say, in the isolated 2v2s. Not that he's bad, but just that I think his strength is playing something like a Rakan and just moving everywhere on the map with his jungler, and that's not necessarily the meta we're in, but I still think him and Wanfeng are fine together, and especially if they're going to play weak side, they are more than capable of being a strong weak side bot. But then we move on over to AL. This was their final series of the year. Obviously, we're in the final day, and it's kind of apropos that they go out on a loss. I know they've been playing a lot better as of recent, but for them not to be able to take a game here, not particularly surprising. A ThunderTalk team that actually had something to fight for in a very important game. There are some positives to take away, though. Pins in the mid lane's been a very big surprise, like a big pleasant surprise, I would say, for AL. He's been very good for this team. Honestly, he's actually been much better than anybody gave him credit for, maybe with the exception of me. I was probably the highest on pins of anybody in the preseason. When we were talking about Ching in the preseason analysis, I was like, he's not the FPX Blaze mid laner I would have taken. I would have taken Pins, who to me, outside of Leave, was the best prospect that I watched in the LDL in 2023. And honestly, that kind of came to fruition. He entered this AL team and took him a little bit to get going, but he was really solid. And I think if you give him a full split on this team, if Zhao Hao maybe can get mentally back on track with what he was in 2022, where he was very good, I think this could be like a team that threatens, top 12 12, top 11, like somewhere in that range. I don't think they're crazy out of that. Obviously, they weren't that in this series. There were some problems. ZDZ was miserable in the top lane, and that's probably my biggest worry is he took a pretty big step back from his 2022 performance in 2023 so far. He's probably been the worst player on this team, and that's not particularly good, although that title might be won by Sword Art. He was also really bad for the majority of the early part of the split. Feels like him and Betty have calmed down a bit, but him and Betty are also not this explosive bot lane that's really going to change the game. You're really relying on this jungle mid to be able to win you a lot of games. It's kind of similar to ThunderTalk, but I think their bot lane is like way better. Betty and Sword Art are just kind of a meh, like a weakness, if you will, but not like strong enough for me to actually care about it. And then ZDZ has been like an actual weakness on the top side, so when you're looking at this team, outlook-wise, moving into summer, like, they have pieces, it's just not particularly likely that they're going to put it together. I think you could build a solid roster around Xiao Hao and Pins, but I don't think that is the roster that they have particularly put together this split. I think that they're fine, especially going into summer, and I think that they're certainly better than what their record shows. There are teams that are way above them in the standings that I don't think are as good as they are, but this is the AL that we expected, and seeing them lose in this final game of the season is definitely not a shock. But for ThunderTalk, congratulations to them. They're making their first playoffs in franchise history, and that's huge. Yukao's been playing great. Huanfeng has had a very underrated split. Yao Yao's one of the best supports in the league, or most fun at the very least. And Beishuan and Hoya are certainly not pushovers. I like ThunderTalk. 9-7 is a good record for them, and I hope that they're able to show, a lot of people around the world why they got to this point once they do finally enter the playoffs. And that's going to bring us to our final series of the LPL regular season in spring of 2023. And of course, we close it out with a Born to Win trade matchup between Weibo Gaming and Rare Adam that Weibo is able to win. They drop game 1 because Leon actually has one of the best games that he's had the entire split. He's got Assume backing him up. This team is honestly looking pretty good, but Weibo, gets their own head out of their ass, and they actually come out for games 2 and 3. And while they're relatively competitive, they definitely have the advantage in both of those, and they're able to take the series in the end. Some good play from Weibo. They confirm themselves in the top 4, which is huge. Again, obviously, you want to be in those upper, situations in terms of, you definitely want to be in top 6, but you would much rather be top 4 than top 6, the same way you'd rather be top 2 than top 4, right? Because it's just an extra round. You get a free round, another bye, which is always going to be a positive for a team. But Weibo picking up a win here is huge. My player of the series is going to go to Light in the bot lane. I haven't given a lot of these to him over the course of the split, but I've actually been very complimentary of how he has played in 2022. It feels like he's kind of been the rock for a Weibo team that can be very volatile, to say the least. When your top side is the Shy, when it's Karsa, when it's Xiaohu, you're going to have some games where they're not necessarily performing, and it's going to be up to the bot lane to kind of make sure that they're on the right track, and I think Light did that a lot over the course of the year. It's good to see him get some recognition in this final series of the year with that player of the series moniker. He was the better ADC in this series, despite what Reddit will tell you. He was really good. I want to give credit to Crisp in that same vein, especially on the Nautilus in game number 3. Some of those engages were really good. I know he died a little bit extra than maybe people would like, but that's going to happen on Nautilus. You're going to go win and you're probably going to die, but if you set your AD carry up to deal a shit ton of damage, then it's absolutely worth it. Trading your life for the enemy's life is almost always a good idea on Nautilus, but the rest of the team was also still good. Karsa was awesome in this series. People are still going to find a way to blame Karsa for everything because that's just what Reddit does, but he was really good, especially on the Sejuani in both of those 2 games. It really feels like when he gets the opportunity to play up his laners, it's just unfair. Like, he facilitates his team almost as well as anybody else in the entire league. He may not be great at accruing resources for himself, but he is really good at getting them for other people. I thought Xiaohu was good, especially in Game 3 on the Vex, a personal fan favorite of mine. And then the Shy, really solid. He's done a really good job of pulling attention away from the enemy team. It feels like, obviously the game plan against Weibo has been to try and get the Shy off of his game and try to, capitalize on maybe some of his positioning mistakes that he's well known for at this point in his career, but he really has been making those over the course of the last few weeks. He hasn't had the same kind of highs that he's had, but a lot of teams have tried to target him, and he really hasn't given in all that much, and that's really good. When you're seeing a lot of pressure sent up to a specific lane, and your team is able to capitalize and gain gold off of that because you can do stuff elsewhere on the map, that's always going to be a massive positive for that team, and that's what the Shy has kind of been for them for a big part of the second half of this split. It's a really big positive, and overall, Weibo's dangerous. Again, this is a team that beat JDG, at parts during the early part of the season. They looked like a potential top 2 team in the LPL. I still think that, you know, reality exists. Like, this is potentially a finals team if everything were to go right. I don't know how plausible that is, but it's definitely not, like, out of the realm of possibility for a team like Weibo to be the ones making their way to MSI. As for Rare Adam on the other side, this team is not very good. They have talent, but they just have not been able to put it together. I'm lower on this team than I think a lot of other people, mostly because I'm lower on Assume, and I have been. I know I don't like sticking my ground. It feels really bad to see a player get, you know, high praise from a lot of the community and for me to kind of be the Debbie Downer. I hate having that role. It's a role that I definitely don't cherish. I would much rather be the one that is positive about most players in the league, but I just don't see the same things that I think a lot of other people are seeing in Assume. I think he puts up a lot of really good stats by getting a lot of cleanup kills in team fights, but you watch his positioning and it's fine. You watch his damage output and it's fine. Like, he just doesn't seem to be this big takeover AD carry like everybody is saying that he's going to be. I've seen some comments of like, oh, LNG should pick up Assume. And I'm like, man, what is the difference between Assume and LP? Like, I don't know. Like, you couldn't possibly tell me that one is, like, definitively better than the other. I certainly don't see that, and that's just where I draw the line. I think the big thing that I want to say about Assume is he's a good AD carry, but it often feels like no matter who he is going against, the enemy AD carry is stronger. Even though he is strong, the enemy AD carry is just stronger in those games, and that is certainly worth something. I think Strive had a fantastic start to the year. It felt like he clearly mentally checked out in a lot of these games. I actually thought he was pretty good this series, and he's, in my opinion, the underrated player on Rare Adam. It's a very similar situation to FPX for me, where LWX gets all of the credit for everything good that team does, when Care, I think, is really the heart and soul. I think it's very similar here for RA, where Strive doesn't get nearly enough credit for how much good he does for this team on a variety of picks. I know people call about his low champion pool, but I think he's proven at this point that that's just not true. And then Leon, shout out Leon, he actually had a pretty good series. I feel really bad for him. This was one of his more complete series of the year, but he's a Feast or Famine jungler. He's the Feast or Famine jungler. He made that popular, and so, you know, credit to him. He's a fun player to watch, but I don't have a lot of faith that he's going to be a part of a lot of winning. And then my dud of the series is going to go to Cube. He's had a really underwhelming split for me. I mean, he's had some games where he's just been bad, and I know I've hyped up Cube in the past as an incredibly solid top laner, someone who you could stick on a good team and he would just be really good weak side, like that kind of top laner that just kind of fits into the rest of the team, but that hasn't exactly been the case this year. He's drafted very aggressive top sides and not been able to win a lot of them, and it's just not the Cube that I know. Maybe he feels a lot of pressure to be able to carry games because the team isn't winning, but whatever the case, it's just not working out at the moment. I would say overall, RA is just one of those teams that I think I'm always going to be lower on than maybe the general consensus. I didn't think they were ever going to be in the playoff race going into this year, and while I do think that they had moments where they looked good, they were never a serious contender for me for that top 10 spot. They never cracked it in my power rankings, and I don't even think they ever got above 12th in it. So, you know, I like some of the players, but I just don't think that they're ever going to be a playoff team in this iteration. But for Weibo, obviously they're a playoff team. They are a potential threat in the playoffs. Like, if this team catches fire, if Xiaohu, Karsa, The Shy, Light, Crisp all play really well and all get on a really big hot streak, this team genuinely could make finals. Hell, they could win finals. Like, it's not out of the realm of possibility for it to happen. I don't think it's going to happen, and obviously I'll be doing my full bracket predictions in my playoff primer video, but Weibo's one of those teams where you absolutely have to, you know, watch out for them and plan for them, because they will take anybody who doesn't off guard. All right, that is going to do it for my LPL Week 10 overview and analysis of all 7 days. Up on the screen now, you're going to see the final standings for Spring Split 2023 in the LPL. Of course, color-coded, depending on where in the playoffs they're going to be starting. 1 and 2 get by far the most buys, 3 and 4, and then 5 and 6, and then 7 plays 10, 8 plays 9. We're going to be previewing all of the playoff stuff in my playoff primer video that's going to come out later this week. We're going to be going over all of my awards for the regular season, MVP, Rookie of the Split, All-Pro, all that good stuff, as well as giving you my full bracket prediction for the LPL. Incredibly excited to go over that, but that's going to be later in the week, and that's why there's no power rankings this week. It's because I'm going to be giving it all to you in that video. But I can't talk about my player of the week and my dud of the week. My player of the week in week number 10 is going to go to Shanji on OMG. He was so good in the top lane. Felt like he got a lot more comfortable going back to some roots in a lot of the picks that he was playing, even pulling out something like the Victor in the top lane. Really fun stuff to watch. In my opinion, he was the most fun and most impactful player to his team's success this week. So Shanji's going to get my player of the week in week number 10, and my dud of the week is going to go to Baolan on Ultra Prime. It was only a matter of time before Ultra Prime got a dud of the week that wasn't Ching, And Balan is going to get it in the final week of the season here, unfortunately. That support was just not very good. Him and Ning capped off a pretty poor season by playing pretty poor in the final week of the season. It's unfortunate. Obviously, Jin Zhao was in that conversation as well, but I ended up settling on Balan. It felt like a pretty easy choice for me. So my Week 10 dud of the week is Balan. My Week 10 player of the week is Shanji. And that's going to do it. I really do hope you guys enjoyed. If you did, let me know down in the comment section below. That's going to do it, obviously, for the LPL regular season, but we still got a ton of content rolling out on this channel. 33 straight days of content, to be precise. If you enjoyed this one, hit the like button, because we're putting out so much. We were putting so much time and effort into these videos. It really would mean a lot to me if you hit that like button, especially if you made it an hour and, 35 minutes into this video. I really, really do appreciate it. Of course, hit subscribe if you haven't yet. If you're new to the channel, we not only post about the LPL, we post about all 4 of the major regions and the NACL, and with playoffs going on in basically all of them right now, there is so much to talk about. If you're interested in comprehensive LoL esports analysis and overviews and everything that you got in this video, click that subscribe button. I promise you will not be disappointed. But, of course, with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all later.